The first bullet cracked the morning calm. It tore through the bank's plate glass window, a spiderweb of fractures blooming outward from the point of impact, before the entire pane dissolved into a shower of glittering shards. Jedediah Kane reacted on instinct, honed by a decade of violence. He shoved his younger partner Daniel to the dusty floorboards, just as a second shot splintered the teller's cage beside them. Screams erupted, a discordant chorus of terror that was immediately swallowed by the authoritative roar of a shotgun. "Nobody moves, nobody dies," a voice commanded, smooth as polished walnut, but cold as a winter grave. Jedediah risked a glance over the overturned table he was using for cover. 4 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, were moving with practiced efficiency. 3 were fanning out, their pistols leveled, while the 4th, clearly the leader, stood silhouetted in the ruined doorway. He was taller than the others, with a certain theatrical grace to his movements. Even in the chaos, Jedediah registered the man's confidence, the casual way he held his silver-inlaid Colt, not like a tool, but like an extension of his will. "You, Marshal," the leader said, his voice cutting through the whimpers of the townsfolk huddled on the floor. Jedediah didn't move. He wasn't a marshal, just a Pinkerton agent passing through this forgotten Texas town. But the outlaw couldn't know that. "I know you're in here. We saw you and your boy go in for coffee money." Daniel shifted beside him, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He was barely 20, eager, and green, still believing the badge on his coat made him invincible. "Jed," he whispered, his hand tightening on the grip of his service revolver. "We can take them." "Stay down," Jedediah hissed, his voice a low growl. "Wait for my signal." But the leader was a student of men. He saw the flicker of youthful bravado in Daniel's eyes. "Your partner looks anxious, Marshal. Tell him a Pinkerton salary isn't worth dying for." The mention of the agency sent a jolt of ice through Jedediah's veins. This wasn't a random robbery. They were targeted. The leader, his eyes crinkling above his mask, in what might have been a smile, took a slow step into the bank. His men began stuffing canvas bags with currency, their movements swift and economical. "It's the deed box we want," the leader announced, his gaze fixed on the large iron safe behind the counter, the one with the railroad patents. "The rest is just a bonus." Jedediah's mind raced. This was more than a simple holdup. It was a professional operation. He knew he had to create a diversion, an opening. He saw it, a heavy inkwell on the clerk's desk, just within reach. "On my count," he whispered to Daniel. "I draw their fire. You take the one on the right." Daniel nodded, his knuckles white. 1, 2. But Daniel never heard 3. Driven by a desperate need to prove himself, he rose from cover a second too soon, his pistol barking. The shot went wide, punching a hole in the ceiling and showering plaster onto the floor. It was a fatal mistake. The world seemed to slow down. 2 of the outlaws pivoted, their guns flashing in unison. Daniel's body jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist. A crimson flower blossomed on his crisp white shirt. He crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide with surprise, a silent question on his lips. "No." The word was torn from Jedediah's throat, a raw sound of pure agony. He rose, his Colt Peacemaker appearing in his hand, a blur of motion. He fired twice. The 2 men who had shot Daniel went down, their bodies thudding against the wooden floor. The 3rd outlaw, startled, swung his pistol toward Jedediah, but a 3rd shot from the Peacemaker caught him in the chest. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged gasps of the terrified hostages. Jedediah stood over Daniel's body, the smoke from his gun barrel curling into the dusty air. He was vaguely aware of the leader, Silas Thorne, standing calmly by the counter, the stolen cash and deed box at his feet. Silas hadn't even flinched. He simply watched, his head tilted with an air of detached curiosity. "Impressive," Kane Silas said, his voice laced with a chilling familiarity. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a handsome, cruel face. A jagged scar ran from his right eyebrow to his jawline, but it did little to mar his charismatic features. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a glint of dark amusement. "But you were always fast. Just not fast enough to save the boy." Jedediah raised his Colt, his hand steady despite the tremor of rage that shook his entire body. "You know my name." "I know everything about you," Silas purred, taking a step forward. He moved with the fluid grace of a panther, utterly unconcerned by the gun pointed at his heart. "I know about the agency. I know about your promotion after the Oakhaven raid. And I know about Eleanor." At the mention of his wife's name, Jedediah's control shattered. A wave of pure black fury washed over him. He lunged forward, swinging the heavy pistol like a club. But Silas was faster. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, and his boots snaked out, catching Jedediah behind the knee. Jedediah fell, his head cracking against the brass railing of the teller's cage. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of spinning lights and sharp, blinding pain. Through the haze, he felt hands on him, searching his pockets. He was too disoriented to resist. Silas's face loomed over him, that cold, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Looking for this?" Silas asked. He dangled a silver locket from its chain. It swung back and forth like a hypnotist's watch, the morning light glinting off its polished surface. It was Jedediah's most precious possession, the only thing he had left of her. Inside was a tiny hand-painted portrait of Eleanor, her smile a beacon in the darkness of his grief. "Give it back," Jedediah rasped, his voice thick with blood and despair. Silas chuckled, a low guttural sound. He snapped the locket open, glanced at the portrait inside, and then shut it with a decisive click. She was beautiful. A shame her husband's work brought so much sorrow. He slipped the locket into his own vest pocket. "Consider this a down payment. Some debts can only be paid in blood, Marshal." With that, he turned and walked out of the bank, disappearing into the blinding Texas sunlight. Jedediah lay on the floor, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, the echoing silence of the room pressing in on him. He could hear the townsfolk beginning to stir their whimpers, turning into sobs. He saw Daniel's lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. But all Jedediah could feel was the cold, empty space in his pocket where the locket used to be. Silas Thorne hadn't just stolen money or killed his partner. He had desecrated a memory. He had stolen the last piece of Jedediah's soul. And in that moment, lying in a pool of his own blood and his partner's, Jedediah Kane made a new vow. This was no longer about the law. This was about vengeance. The sun baked the cracked earth into a mosaic of ochre and rust. It was a relentless, indifferent heat that seemed to leach the color from the sky and the life from the land. In the town of Redemption, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty expanse surrounding them. Life moved at the pace of a dying man's last breath. For Jedediah Kane, this purgatorial stillness was a mirror of his own soul. His temporary quarters, a small room above the marshal's office, were stark and impersonal. A narrow cot, a rickety table, and a single chair were the only furnishings. The air was thick with the scent of stale whiskey and gun oil. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy window, the only movement in a room that felt more like a tomb. 2 weeks had passed since the robbery, 2 weeks since he had buried Daniel in the town's barren cemetery. The Pinkerton agency had sent condolences, a formal bloodless letter that spoke of duty and sacrifice. They had also ordered him to remain in Redemption to assist local law enforcement and await further instructions. Jedediah knew what it really meant. He was on ice, a liability whose personal vendetta was too volatile for a respectable detective agency to sanction. Grief was a physical presence in the room, a heavy cloak he could not shed. He didn't speak of it, not to the nervous town marshal or the sympathetic women who left plates of food outside his door. Instead, he showed it. He showed it in the way his gaze remained fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, in the way he neglected the food until it grew cold, in the terse, one-word answers he gave to any who dared approach him. His grief lived in his hands, which were never still. They were either methodically disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling his cult peacemaker, an obsessive ritual he performed 3 times a day, or tracing the faint outline in his vest pocket where Eleanor's locket had once rested. The world outside his window was a study in shades of brown. The relentless desert sun bleached the life out of everything, leaving behind a palette of dust, decay, and despair. But it was in this very landscape of hardship that Jedediah first noticed a flicker of life that defied the oppressive heat. His name was Leo. The boy was 14, though the lean, wiry frame and the old man gravity in his eyes made him seem both younger and older at the same time. An orphan, Jedediah had learned who slept in the hayloft of the livery stable and worked for his keep, mucking out stalls and tending to the horses. Leo was a creature of routine and quiet observation. He moved with a purpose that was rare in a town where most men simply drifted. He saw everything. He noticed the way Jedediah's horse favored its left foreleg after a long ride and would have a poultice ready without being asked. He saw the untouched food trays outside Jedediah's door and started leaving a canteen of fresh, cool water instead. He never spoke unless spoken to, but his eyes, clear and startlingly blue, missed nothing. They saw the pain behind Jedediah's stony facade and the grief that clung to him like his own shadow. One sweltering afternoon, Jedediah was in the stable methodically brushing down his roan mare when Leo approached, holding a small, crudely carved wooden horse. "Found this," Leo said, his voice quiet. "Figured your horse might like a friend." He offered the carving to Jedediah. It was rough, but the lines were surprisingly fluid, capturing the spirit of a wild Mustang in mid-gallop. Jedediah stopped brushing and took the small horse. His calloused fingers, so accustomed to the cold steel of a gun, felt clumsy holding the delicate piece of wood. "You make this?" Leo nodded, scuffing the toe of his worn-out boot in the dirt. "Helps pass the time. Gives my hands something to do." Jedediah understood. He looked from the wooden horse to his own hands, calloused and scarred from a life of violence. His hands took things apart. They ended lives. This boy's hands, though smudged with dirt and grease, created something. For the first time in weeks, Jedediah felt a crack in the icy wall he had built around his heart. He saw in Leo an echo of the idealism his partner Daniel had possessed, a flicker of innocence, in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. "It's good work," Jedediah said, his voice raspy from disuse. He placed the carving carefully on a ledge in the stall. "Thank you." Leo simply nodded again, a flicker of a smile touching his lips, before he turned and went back to his work. The brief exchange was a small thing, a tiny island of civility in Jedediah's vast ocean of grief. But it was something. It was a reminder that even in a place called redemption, where hope seemed to come only to die, life stubbornly persisted. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Jedediah sat by his window cleaning his peacemaker. The rhythmic click-clack of metal on metal was a familiar comfort, a mantra against the chaos in his soul. His duty as a Pinkerton agent demanded patience, procedure, and adherence to the law. But the man inside him, the husband who had lost his wife to fever and his last connection to her to a killer, screamed for something else entirely. He was a man torn in two. One half was Jedediah Kane, the efficient, dispassionate agent who followed orders and closed cases. The other half was a raw, gaping wound, a man consumed by a grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole, a grief that could only be salved by the hot, brutal finality of revenge. And as the last light faded from the sky, leaving redemption to the mercy of the coming night, he didn't know which half would win. The telegraph arrived on a Tuesday, its staccato clicks a jarring intrusion into the town's somnolent rhythm. The young operator, barely a man himself, delivered the flimsy yellow paper to Jedediah with an air of nervous reverence, as if handing over a death warrant. It was from Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago, a summons from his supervisor, Mr. Abernathy. Jedediah found him waiting in the lobby of the town's only hotel, a man who seemed utterly out of place in the dusty, sun-bleached world of redemption. Abernathy was impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit, despite the oppressive heat, his starched collar a fortress around his thick neck. He was the embodiment of the agency, formal, bureaucratic, and radiating an aura of unassailable authority. Kane Abernathy said, foregoing any greeting. His voice was dry as last year's ledger. He gestured to a chair opposite him. Sit. Jedediah sat, his own dusty, trail-worn clothes, a stark contrast to Abernathy's urban polish. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken resentments. Abernathy was the one who had partnered him with Daniel, convinced that the boy's youthful energy would temper Jedediah's grim disposition. Finally, Abernathy cleared his throat and placed a thick file on the table between them. The agency extends its deepest sympathies for the loss of Agent Miller. He was a promising young man. The words were delivered with the emotional detachment of a banker discussing a defaulted loan. His name was Daniel Jedediah, said his voice flat and cold. Abernathy's eyes, small and hard like pebbles, met his. Indeed. Which brings us to the matter at hand. Silas Thorne. Jedediah felt a familiar coil of rage tighten in his gut, but his face remained a mask of indifference. Our investigation has confirmed that Thorne and his gang are responsible for a string of disruptions along the new railroad expansion territory. Abernathy continued, tapping a manicured finger on the file. He's been terrorizing settlers, driving them off their land and seizing their property under a series of falsified claims. We have reason to believe he has stolen a portfolio of official land deeds, which he intends to use to illegally claim a massive tract of land vital to the railroad's interests. Jedediah listened the official story, a pale, sanitized version of the violent reality he had witnessed. There was no mention of a targeted attack, no mention of Daniel's murder, no mention of the stolen locket. To the agency, this was a property dispute, a matter of contracts and commerce. Your new assignment, Kane, is to track Thorne, retrieve the stolen land deeds, and bring him to justice. The railroad is our client, and they are paying a considerable fee for a swift resolution. Justice. The word tasted like ash in Jedediah's mouth. Or is it just about protecting the railroad's investment? A flicker of annoyance crossed Abernathy's face. The motives of our clients are not our concern. Our concern is fulfilling the terms of our contract. You are the best tracker we have, Kane. Despite your recent emotional complications, your record is unparalleled. Find the deeds. Apprehend the man. Is that clear? The bureaucratic language, the cold dismissal of his grief, the reduction of Daniel's life to an emotional complication, it all fueled the fire simmering inside Jedediah. But he saw the opportunity for what it was. The agency was unwittingly giving him exactly what he wanted, a license to hunt Silas Thorne. He reached for the file, his movements slow and deliberate. And my orders. You will operate under the official guise of investigating the land disputes. You are authorized to use any necessary force to secure the deeds and apprehend Thorne. You will have the full backing of the agency's resources." Abernathy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The railroad baron funding this operation, a Mr. Wallace, has made it clear he prefers Thorne be brought in dead or alive. He has a vested interest in seeing this matter concluded with extreme prejudice. Do you understand my meaning, Agent Kane?" Jedediah understood perfectly. He was being unleashed. His personal vendetta now aligned perfectly with the cold, calculated interests of corporate power. He could pursue his revenge under the sanctioned banner of the law. "I understand," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. He didn't accept the mission for duty or for the agency or for some faceless railroad baron. He accepted it for the image of Daniel's surprised eyes as he fell for the empty space in his pocket that felt like a hole in his chest, for the memory of Eleanor's smile now in the possession of a killer. He accepted it for the chance to reclaim what had been stolen from him. "Good," Abernathy said, settling back in his chair satisfied. "We expect results, Kane. Don't let your personal feelings compromise the objective." As Jedediah walked out of the hotel and into the blinding sunlight, the file tucked under his arm, he felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him for the first time in weeks. Abernathy was wrong. It was precisely his personal feelings that would ensure the objective was met. Silas Thorne thought he was setting the terms of this war. He had no idea what he had truly awakened. Jedediah Kane, the grieving husband, would use the full force of Jedediah Kane, the Pinkerton agent, to bring his own brutal, intimate brand of justice to the man who had dared to touch his past. The trail left by Silas Thorne was a deliberate, arrogant scar across the landscape. He wasn't trying to hide. He was leaving a message. Jedediah found it 3 days out from redemption in the burned-out shell of a homesteader's cabin. The family was gone, fled, with whatever they could carry. The well had been poisoned, the field salted. It was an act of calculated cruelty designed not just to drive people off their land, but to ensure they could never return. Amidst the ashes and debris pinned to the charred doorframe with a Bowie knife was a playing card. The Queen of Hearts. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up Jedediah's spine. He pulled the knife from the wood and took the card. A single neat hole was punched through its center, as if from a carefully aimed bullet. His mind flashed back to a summer evening years ago by a lazy river with Eleanor. He had been teaching her to shoot, and to prove her aim, she had tacked the Queen of Hearts to a tree and put a bullet clean through it. It became their private joke, their symbol. Always aim for the heart. She had whispered, her breath warm against his ear. How could Thorne know it was impossible? A coincidence, he tried to tell himself, but the cold certainty in his gut told him otherwise. This was a message meant only for him. Silas wasn't just running. He was leading Jedediah on a twisted pilgrimage through the ruins of his own past. He pushed on the Queen of Hearts tucked securely in his vest, a cold counterpoint to the empty space where the locket should have been. His investigation into the supposed land dispute became a series of unsettling discoveries. He interviewed settlers who had been driven from their homes. Their stories were chillingly similar. They described Silas not as a common land grabber, but as a phantom who seemed to know their deepest vulnerabilities. He didn't just threaten them with violence. He dismantled their lives with surgical precision. One farmer spoke of how his daughter's prized pony had been found slain, another of how his wife's heirloom wedding dress had been shredded and left on their doorstep. These were acts of psychological warfare designed to break their spirits. And as Jedediah listened, a pattern began to emerge. The homesteads Thorne targeted were all connected, however tenuously, to a case Jedediah had worked years ago, a rustling operation he had broken up, earning him a commendation. It was as if Thorne was systematically erasing his past accomplishments, turning his victories into monuments of suffering. His one constant source of reliable information was Leo. Before leaving Redemption, Jedediah had given the boy a handful of coins and a simple instruction: keep your ears open. A telegraph line connected Redemption to the larger towns to the east, and Jedediah arranged a simple code for Leo to use. The boy proved to be a natural informant. His unassuming presence allowed him to overhear conversations in the saloon and the general store that a man with a badge never would. Leo's messages, delivered in terse coded bursts of Morse, were invaluable. Thorne's men bought supplies, heading west, spoke of Coyote Canyon. Man matching Thorne's description, paid for information about old agency cases, asked about Oak Haven raid. The dispatches did more than provide intelligence. They forged an unlikely bond between the hardened agent and the lonely orphan. In Leo's crisp, efficient reports, Jedediah heard an echo of the professionalism he had once valued above all else. And in the boy's occasional off-topic questions: is your horse well? Remember to check for burrs in the high chaparral. He sensed a genuine concern that chipped away at his icy reserve. Leo saw past the grieving, vengeful man and glimpsed the protector, the lawman, the hero Jedediah himself had forgotten he could be. Jedediah started ending his own telegraphs with a simple sign-off: watch yourself, kid. It was as close to affection as he could manage. One evening, camped by a small brackish creek, Jedediah was cleaning his rifle when another piece of the puzzle fell into place. He had been tracking a small group of Thorne's men, keeping his distance, observing their habits. As they sat around their own campfire across the valley, a faint sound drifted on the wind. It was a man humming a tune, a soft, melancholic melody that was instantly horribly familiar. It was Eleanor's lullaby. A simple folk tune she would hum to herself as she worked in her garden, or as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset. It was a private, intimate sound, a piece of music that existed only in the quiet spaces of their life together. To hear it now coming from the mouth of one of Thorne's killers was a violation that cut deeper than any bullet. The official story from the Pinkerton agency was a lie. This wasn't about land deeds or railroad patents. Abernathy was either a fool or a co-conspirator. The Queen of Hearts, the targeting of old cases, Eleanor's lullaby, it was all a carefully constructed torment. Silas Thorne knew him. He knew his history, his triumphs, and his deepest, most secret sorrows. This wasn't a manhunt. It was a haunting. And Jedediah was no longer sure who was the ghost and who was the man. The abandoned homestead stood like a skeleton against the bruised twilight sky. It was the place Thorne had been leading him to all along. Jedediah could feel it in the marrow of his bones. This was the epicenter of the Oak Haven raid, the operation 5 years ago that had put another notch on his reputation and a permanent stain on his soul. The official report had called it a success. A gang of violent outlaws, led by a ruthless man named Caleb, had been neutralized. Jedediah had led the charge. He had been the one to pull the trigger on Caleb as the man reached for what Jedediah had assumed was a weapon. The promotion had followed soon after. So had the nightmares. He tethered his horse and approached the dilapidated cabin on foot, his Colt a heavy, cold weight in his hand. The door hung from a single hinge, groaning a mournful protest as he pushed it open. The inside was a chaotic tableau of decay and violence. Furniture was overturned, crockery shattered. But it was the silence that was most unnerving, a profound, waiting silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. On a small, dust-covered table in the center of the room lay a single object, a leather-bound family Bible. Jedediah's hand trembled slightly as he reached for it. He opened it to the flyleaf, where the family history was recorded in a neat, elegant script. Thorne family. The names swam before his eyes. Caleb Thorne, born 1845. Silas Thorne, born 1848. And beneath them, a woman's name, Eleanor Thorne, born 1851, died 1872. The world tilted on its axis. Eleanor. Thorne, no. It was a coincidence. It had to be. His Eleanor's maiden name had been Jennings. He had seen the marriage certificate, filed it himself. But as he stared at the name, a cold, sickening realization began to dawn. Tucked into the back of the Bible was a small sepia-toned photograph. Jedediah pulled it out, his fingers numb. It showed two young men standing side by side, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They were smiling, full of the careless confidence of youth. One was younger, his face handsome and unmarred by the scar he now wore Silas. The other was older, his features familiar in a way that made Jedediah's stomach clench. It was Caleb, the man he had killed in this very room 5 years ago. Jedediah sank onto a broken chair, the photograph trembling in his hand. The truth, brutal and undeniable, crashed down on him. The land dispute was a phantom. The stolen deeds were a lie. This entire mission, orchestrated from the beginning, was a trap. Silas Thorne was Caleb's brother. And he had spent 5 years meticulously crafting a revenge plot so personal, so intimate, that it had turned Jedediah's own life into the weapon that would destroy him. He was the monster in Silas Thorne's story. The promotion, the commendations, the reputation he had built, it was all founded on the blood of an innocent man. He remembered the raid now with horrifying clarity. Caleb hadn't been reaching for a gun. He had been reaching for something on the mantelpiece. Jedediah staggered over to the hearth, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, half hidden under a layer of soot and debris, was a small silver frame. He picked it up and wiped it clean. Inside was a portrait. A beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. It was the same portrait from his locket. Eleanor. The Bible, the photograph, the portrait, it was an altar to a life he had destroyed. A life he hadn't even known existed. Eleanor Thorne Silas and Caleb's younger sister had died of fever years before Jedediah had ever met his own Eleanor Jennings. A tragic coincidence of names that had given Silas the perfect tool for his revenge. He had found Jedediah's one vulnerability, the sacred memory of his wife, and twisted it into a blade. The locket wasn't just a trophy. It was a symbol of everything Silas believed Jedediah had stolen from his family. The hunter had not just become the hunted. He had discovered that the monster he had been chasing all along was his own reflection. The raid, the killing, the promotion, it had all been a lie. He was a pawn, a murderer, the architect of his own damnation. And now Silas Thorne was coming to collect his debt. The cryptic words from the bank robbery echoed in his mind, no longer a mystery, but a pronouncement of judgment. Some debts can only be paid in blood. And Jedediah knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the blood would be his own. He rode back to redemption under the cold, indifferent gaze of a million stars, a changed man. The fire of vengeance that had fueled him was gone, replaced by the hollow ache of guilt and the sickening weight of the truth. He was no longer a lawman seeking justice, but a killer awaiting his executioner. When he reached the livery stable, the first glimmer of dawn was painting the eastern sky a bruised purple. The stable was quiet, the air thick with the sweet smell of hay and horses. But something was wrong. The door to the tack room was ajar, a lantern inside, casting long dancing shadows. Leo's bedroll in the hayloft was empty. Jedediah's hand went to his gun, his senses screaming. He pushed the tack room door open. The room was empty, but a message was scrawled on the slate board where Leo kept track of the feed orders. The handwriting was elegant, mocking, and chillingly familiar. Humper, the boy has paid for your sins. If you wish to see him alive again, come to the old mission church in the Badlands. Come alone. Your judgment awaits. Pinned to the bottom of the board by a knife was a single playing card. The Queen of Hearts. Rage pure and undiluted surged through Jedediah, eclipsing the guilt and despair. Silas had crossed a line. This was no longer about the past, about Caleb or Eleanor Thorne. This was about Leo. An innocent boy, the one flicker of light in Jedediah's suffocating darkness, had been dragged into this twisted quest for revenge. His Pinkerton training screamed at him to be rational. Follow protocol. Telegraph the agency request backup, set a trap. It was the smart play, the professional play. It was also the coward's play. Waiting for backup could take days. By then, Leo would be dead. The agency, with its bureaucratic inertia and its complicity in the Oakhaven lie, couldn't be trusted. Abernathy and the railroad baron wanted Silas Thorne dealt with, but they wouldn't risk an open conflict to save one orphan boy. The choice was no longer between duty and revenge. It was between a flawed, corrupt system and a personal code of honor he hadn't even realized he still possessed. He looked at the empty hayloft, at the crudely carved wooden horse Leo had given him, still sitting on the ledge in his mare's stall. He thought of the boy's quiet competence, his unwavering belief in the hero Jedediah was supposed to be. Saving Leo was not about redemption for his past sins. It was about honoring the future of an innocent boy. It was the one right thing he could do in a world of wrongs. He would not wait for backup. He would not follow protocol. He would go to that church alone. He was no longer Agent Kane, a cog in the Pinkerton machine. He was just a man driven by a singular, desperate purpose to save a child. He checked his Colt, filled his pockets with ammunition, and saddled his roan. As he rode out of redemption, the rising sun at his back, he knew he was riding toward his own reckoning. But for the first time since Daniel's death, his purpose was clear, his resolve absolute. He would trade his life for Leo's without a second's hesitation. The ghosts of his past could wait. A living boy needed him now. The Badlands were a place God had forgotten. A jagged, windswept expanse of rock and sand where the earth looked like it had been torn open and left to bleed. The abandoned church stood on a lonely mesa, a skeletal silhouette against a sky the color of lead. As Jedediah approached, a sandstorm began to gather on the horizon, a churning wall of brown that promised to swallow the world. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons like a chorus of damned souls. He left his horse in a sheltered arroyo and made the final approach on foot, the stinging sand and scouring his face. The church was a decaying ruin. Its roof had long since collapsed, and the stained glass windows were empty, jagged mouths that gaped at the turbulent sky. He pushed open the heavy, groaning doors and stepped inside. The interior was a cavern of shadows and swirling dust. Pews lay overturned like fallen soldiers. At the far end of the nave, where the altar should have been a single lantern, cast a pool of sickly yellow light. Leo was there, tied to a splintered wooden cross that had been leaned against the crumbling wall. He was conscious, his eyes wide with fear, a dirty gag silencing him. And standing beside him, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife, was Silas Thorne. He looked up as Jedediah entered, his charismatic smile a grotesque slash in the dim light. "Welcome, Agent Kane Silas," said his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I trust your journey was illuminating, punctual as always, a professional to the last." "Let the boy go, Thorne." Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. He kept his Colt holstered, his hands held open at his sides. "This is between you and me. Oh, everything is between you and me. Silas agreed, taking a slow, deliberate step away from Leo. But the boy is a necessary part of the lesson. You see, you built your career on the blood of my family. It seems only fitting that your redemption should be bought with the blood of yours. He's not my family. Isn't he? Silas countered, his eyes glinting. I've watched you, Cain. I've seen the way you look at him. He's the son you never had, the innocence you lost. He's your penance. And today your penance will be paid. The sandstorm hit the church with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked through the broken windows, and a blinding curtain of sand filled the air, reducing visibility to mere feet. The lantern flickered wildly, casting the scene in a strobe of light and shadow. This was the moment. The confrontation wasn't just about bullets. It was a battle of wills, a psychological war fought in the heart of a tempest. Jedediah knew a straight gunfight was what Silas expected. He had to be smarter. "You're right," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "I killed your brother. I was there. I pulled the trigger." Silas's smile faltered, his composure momentarily broken by the blunt confession. "You admit it then? You admit to murdering an unarmed man?" "I admit to killing him," Jedediah corrected. "But I wasn't the one who murdered him." He took a step forward into the swirling vortex of sand and shadow. "You've spent 5 years planning this. You've learned everything about me. My wife, my partner, my cases. You're a meticulous man, Thorne. So tell me, in all your research, did you ever look into the man who wanted your brother's land? Did you ever ask why the Pinkerton agency was hired in the first place?" Silas hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Caleb was a homesteader. He was in the way of progress. He was in the way of a railroad baron named Wallace. Jedediah pressed, his voice rising above the storm. A man who wanted that land so badly he was willing to do anything to get it. A man who hired my agency and fed my supervisor Abernathy a steady diet of lies. He manufactured evidence, paid witnesses to claim your brother was leading a gang of outlaws. He painted Caleb as a monster to justify taking his land. Lies, Silas spat, but the word lacked conviction. "Is it?" Jedediah challenged. "You found my wife's name. Did you not find it strange that another woman with the same name, your sister, lived just miles from the proposed railroad line? Did you not wonder why my superiors sent me an agent with a reputation for ruthless efficiency on a simple rustling case?" He saw the seeds of doubt taking root. Silas's meticulously constructed world of righteous vengeance was beginning to fracture. "They didn't send me to arrest your brother, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper. "They sent me to execute him. I was a pawn, a tool, the gun in Wallace's hand." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I pulled the trigger, and I will live with that for the rest of my days. But the men who murdered your brother are sitting in comfortable offices in Chicago counting their money. Men you've allowed to escape justice while you've been hunting a ghost." Silas stared at him, his face a mask of confusion and rage. The foundation of his revenge, the simple, clear-cut narrative of a good man wronged, was crumbling around him. "I have proof." Silas finally choked out his hand, reaching into his coat. "Letters. An affidavit from a man who helped frame him." "Then you're a fool," Jedediah roared, the sound competing with the storm. "You've been holding the evidence to convict the real killers for years, and instead of using it, you concocted this elaborate stage play. You let your grief and your pride blind you. You hunted me, the weapon, while the men who aimed me walked free." He saw Leo struggling against his bonds, his eyes wide, pleading. The moment was now. "Your fight isn't with me, Thorne," Jedediah said, taking another deliberate step forward, his hand still far from his gun. It's with them. Give me the evidence. Help me bring them down. Let us get justice for Caleb. Together. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas stood frozen, torn between the all-consuming hatred that had driven him for 5 years and the terrible dawning realization that Jedediah was telling the truth. The proof he clutched in his hand was not a tool for tormenting one man, but a key to dismantling an entire conspiracy. But the poison of vengeance had sunk too deep. No, Silas whispered, his face twisting into a snarl of pure malice. He's dead because of you. It ends here. He raised his pistol. But Jedediah was already moving. He dove to the side as Silas's gun flashed the bullets screaming past his ear and ricocheting off the stone wall. Jedediah rolled his own Colt, finally clearing its holster. The sand was so thick he could barely see firing at the muzzle flash, the sound of the gunshots, a deafening staccato against the storm's roar. A cry of pain cut through the wind. Jedediah scrambled forward, his eyes straining in the gloom. He saw Silas on his knees, clutching a wound in his leg. The fight was over. He rushed past the wounded man, his knife flashing as he cut Leo free. He pulled the gag from the boy's mouth and helped him to his feet. "Are you hurt?" Jedediah asked, his hands checking the boy for injuries. Leo shook his head, coughing, his eyes locked on Silas. "Jedediah." He was telling the truth, wasn't he, about his brother? Jedediah looked at Silas Thorne, crumpled on the floor of the ruined church, his grand revenge shattered, the proof of his brother's innocence clutched in his hand. The moral victory was non-existent. There were no heroes here, only broken men, victims of a system far more cruel and impersonal than any single outlaw. "Yes, kid," Jedediah said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all. He was. The storm raged on, but inside the church a new and terrible silence had fallen. Instead of the cold finality of a bullet, Jedediah offered Silas a tourniquet. He bound the man's leg to the act, a strange, intimate truce in the aftermath of their war. He took the packet of letters and the sworn affidavit from Silas's unresisting hand. Justice, he had come to realize, was not about vengeance. It was about truth. The journey back was a silent, somber affair. Jedediah rode with Leo in front of him, the boy's small frame a warm, living shield against the ghosts of the past. Silas, bound and grim-faced, followed on his own horse. The sandstorm had passed, leaving the air clean and the world raw as if scrubbed clean of its illusions. Jedediah didn't take Silas to the local marshal. He took him to the telegraph office. For the next 2 days, he occupied the small building, sending a flurry of coded messages that shook the Pinkerton agency to its foundations. He sent copies of the affidavit to 3 different newspapers in 3 different states. He telegraphed Abernathy, directly laying out the entire conspiracy, naming Wallace, and detailing the agency's complicity in the framing and murder of Caleb Thorne. He made it clear that he had the original evidence and that if anything happened to him, Leo or Silas, it would be released to the world. He was no longer an agent following orders. He was a man setting a fire. The response was swift and panicked. Abernathy, his bureaucratic composure shattered, agreed to a meeting. But Jedediah didn't go. He sent his terms instead: a full public exoneration of Caleb Thorne, the immediate arrest of Wallace, and an internal investigation into Abernathy's conduct, and one final non-negotiable demand. The trial was a sensation. Jedediah Kane, decorated Pinkerton agent, took the stand not as a hero, but as a witness to the corruption of the system he had served. He testified against his own supervisor, laying bare the conspiracy that had led to an innocent man's death. Silas Thorne, granted immunity for his own testimony, corroborated every word, his voice stripped of its charismatic arrogance, filled only with the quiet grief of a brother, finally able to speak the truth. Wallace and Abernathy were convicted. Caleb Thorne's name was cleared, his homestead returned to his brother's keeping. On the final day of the trial, Jedediah handed his badge and his official letter of resignation to a junior agent. He walked out of the courthouse and into the clean, bright sunlight, a free man for the first time in years. He had turned his back on the flawed, hollow justice of the agency to pursue a more difficult, more meaningful truth. He found Leo waiting on the courthouse steps. The boy looked older, the last traces of childhood erased by the ordeal they had endured. "What now?" Leo asked, his voice quiet. Jedediah looked at the boy, this orphan who had shown him more loyalty and courage than any badged agent he had ever known. He saw not a burden, but a future. "I filed some papers this morning." Jedediah said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Adoption papers. If you'll have me, that is. It's not much of a legacy, but it's a start." Tears welled in Leo's eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. He simply nodded a slow, solemn acceptance that sealed their new bond. They were no longer a lawman and an informant, but a father and a son. Two solitary souls who had found a family in the ruins of a broken world. Together, they walked away from the courthouse, leaving the shadows of the past behind them, their faces turned toward the promise of a new horizon. The seasons turned. The harsh, unforgiving sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. On a small tract of land just outside Redemption, a new horse ranch began to take shape. The work was hard, the days long, but it was honest work. It was about building something, not tearing it down. Jedediah and Leo worked side by side, their shared labor, a silent conversation that healed the wounds the past had inflicted. The calluses on Jedediah's hands softened, the grim lines around his eyes eased. The sound of Leo's laughter, a rare and precious thing, became the new soundtrack of his life. One cool November morning, Jedediah rode out alone. In his pocket, nestled in a soft leather pouch, was the silver locket. It had been returned to him from Silas Thorne's personal effects, a final unspoken acknowledgement of the complex debt that lay between them. He rode to the small windswept cemetery, where his Eleanor lay her simple headstone, a quiet testament to a life lived with grace. He sat on the dry grass beside her grave, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. For a long time, he just sat there, the weight of all the years, all the grief settling over him. He had carried her memory like a shield, a justification for his anger and his isolation. He had clung to his grief because he was afraid that letting it go meant letting her go too. Finally, he took out the locket. His thumb traced the familiar engravings on its surface. With a soft click, he opened it. The tiny hand-painted portrait of Eleanor smiled up at him, her eyes full of the love he had never stopped missing. He looked at her face, memorizing every line, every detail, one last time. He saw not a ghost to be avenged, but a memory to be honored. And he knew with a sudden, profound clarity that the best way to honor her memory was not to dwell in the past with her, but to build a future worthy of the love she had given him. He closed the locket with a gentle snap. He didn't put it back in his pocket. Instead, he dug a small hole in the earth at the base of her headstone with his bare hands. He placed the locket inside the silver cool against the dark, rich soil. As he covered it, burying the last anchor to his grief, he felt a weight lift from his soul, a burden he hadn't even realized he was still carrying. He was no longer Jedediah Kane Pinkerton agent, a man defined by loss and violence. He was just a father, a rancher, a man who had found his redemption not in revenge, but in the quiet, steady work of building a new life. He brushed the dirt from his hands, and looked toward the horizon where his ranch and his son were waiting.